Today we are asking a carbon fibre expert 12 challenging questions. From the lifespan of carbon.
Now I need to be very clear about this.
What are the best carbon frames?
That's a difficult question because it's like apples and pears.
Carbon versus aluminium versus steel.
The thing with carbon, and this is the difference between any other material and a composite material.
Also Rob's thoughts on cheap Chinese carbon frames.
If you asked me this question back then when you bought those bikes 10 years ago, I'd say you got lucky.
And much, much more. Rob has over 12 years experience and him and his team have repaired over 14,000 carbon fibre frames. Now a big thank you to you guys for posting these questions on my community tab. You guys asked, so here we are. Without any physical damage caused by a crash or impact, etc., what would you say is a lifespan of a carbon frame?
Again, it's a very difficult one to answer. If it's in a, if you're doing some weekend riding and you don't take it too seriously, the bike will last you forever if you don't knock it about. Recently, there's been some studies done, one specific one at McLaren, where they were testing fatigue on carbon components in Formula One racing cars, and discovered that there was indeed a level of delamination inside these frames. Now, I need to be very clear about this. For the average rider to delaminate bottom brackets, chainstay, junction, is going to be a lifelong exercise. If you're a pro putting out massive watts, over time, that bike will get a little whippy. Would you notice it as an amateur? Probably not, but the pro would, because he's on that bike all day long. So the short of it is, yes, a bike can get whippier, a carbon bike, whereas first we didn't think that was the case. It is the case, but it is very rare that you can actually get to overflex the bike to a point where it does that level of delamination. So probably the simple answer is no, it will probably last you a lifetime. There is also this preconception that carbon is vulnerable to UV and chemicals and water ingress, winter riding, and so on and so forth. Carbon in itself is pretty innate. Once the matrix, that's the glue, cures, the only thing that can really affect a carbon frame, and not so much the carbon but the glue that glues it together, is heat.
What are the top 3 best quality frames in your experience as far as build quality and durability?
That's a difficult question because it's like apples and pears, and I'm not trying to skirt the question because it's a very valid question. I'd have said in carbon, your safest bike to ride is the one with the most carbon in it. Yeah. If you're looking for a lightweight bike and you want to do hill climbs and so on, that's your thing. It's going to be light. You're going to sacrifice structural wall thickness integrity, basically from puncturing. It's going to be your biggest issue. Not necessarily weight issue on the frame that will make the bike break when you hit a pothole, but its ability to be able to handle falling on the side of a pavement wall, something falling on the top tube. If you asked me this about steel bikes or aluminium bikes, I would have said the best quality aluminium, or the style of the branding, because there isn't much that you can do with alloys once they in bulk. But in carbon it's different. There's so many different permutations on the way you can make a bike. I've just said your safest bet is to go probably with the biggest brands, the brands with the biggest research and development side, the brands that do the least amount of major experimentation, crazy looking bikes. I think that's probably where you want to be. I won't mention names, but the main brands are probably your safest bet.
Although your focus is on carbon, what do you think about other frame materials like titanium, steel and aluminium?
You left bamboo out. You can make a bike out of many different things. It just depends on whether it's fit for purpose. In the old days, the only reason we have such a legacy of steel frames in the beginning was because steel was available. So they made bikes out of steel. There's some good things about crystalline materials that absorb stresses much easier. Aluminium, there's a progress on from steel to aluminium. Aluminium becomes available. They're able to draw aluminium into different shapes. Just before the carbon world came alive, carbon wasn't really available at that time. It was more the aerospace industry, which is why so many carbon people talk about this aerospace thing, which is, it's a bit long in the tooth now. Titanium, again, there's no specific reason why titanium is any better. Yes, corrosion, but then stainless steel, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. The thing with carbon, and this is the difference between any other material and a composite material. is that carbon you can shape any which way. You can get really exciting bicycles, you can get really interesting bicycles, you can get really high performance bicycles, you can get bicycles that can take a lot of damage downhill riding. I'm not saying they are all positive. There's some negative things about carbon, but if you want a bike that has low weight, then you're going to have to sacrifice the strength, the robustness of the frame. There's a human being puts that much power. You put a bicycle between their legs, they're going to be doing something with that particular bike, whether they're touring around the world or they're climbing all the mountains in the Alps. I'm digressing, but there isn't any one particular material that's better all round than others. So carbon is just a very, very exciting material to be working with, and it's probably, in my view, carbon fiber is almost designed for bicycles in the way that you can get them to the weight that they're at.
In terms of carbon versus steel, would you say there's a time and a place for each?
No, I mean there's a real concern. We were talking about it earlier when we were in the workshop about communication, where the carbon brands are not really communicating as well as they should be to customers, in the sense that there are limitations to carbon. Yes, they're the most incredible. Until you've ridden a carbon bicycle, I don't believe you've actually really ridden a bicycle all around, frankly. Steel bikes are wonderful. They've got their own strengths. They've got their own characteristics. There have been comments about, I'm never getting on a carbon bike, seeing all the damage that's done on these bikes and how easy they are to break. Well, if you go and look at one of Jordan's videos when I challenged him to break a bike with a hammer, he started off tapping it and then ended up struggling to delaminate it. And in some other ways, I'm sure there's many of the cyclists out there that would attest to just having touched the bike somewhere or dropped something on it and it's broken. Depends what bike that object landed on. Same with a steel bike, aluminium bike. If you have an accident on that bike, I challenge you to try and straighten that frame or to try and repair that in the same way that you can carbon. So although there's some upsides to steel frames, they're certainly not structurally as strong. That's a fact. We know that. Depending, again, how light carbon bikes are getting now compared to an average steel bike.
At what price is it better to purchase a carbon frame over an alloy frame?
Performance. That's not to say that alloy frames can't perform, because there'll be a lot of you screaming at me now. It's not the case. It's just that you can take an alloy frame to a certain point, and then after that point is the junction point. You're kind of asking me that question. Is if I was trying to beat my last Strava time up a mountain and I'd got to my full level of fitness, the only way forward is to get onto a carbon frame, and you will improve that time. The average alloy frames are really nice bikes. They're robust, they're very handy. Most of them don't get nicked anymore. There's a lot of practicality reasons to having alloy and steel frames. Steel frames, prone to rust, but they hold their value really well, especially the Italian brands. They're just soaring in prices because they don't really make them anymore.
What carbon bikes would you buy for yourself at a budget range, mid-range and top of the range?
Let's start with budget range first. Any carbon bike. Any carbon bike probably produced from around 2005 up. Any time below that, there's a little bit too much development work going on, too many things going wrong, particularly with aluminium, galvanic corrosion, all that kind of stuff. Medium range, I would go second-hand on eBay and get the bike checked over by a carbon specialist for sure. You'll get a lot of bang for your buck. They don't sell for that much. There's a lot of carbon bikes around. You can get a really good bike. Top-end bike, that would be a different thing. That would be me trying to be a weekend warrior pro, and I want a super nice bike. For that, I would go for a hill climbing bike, particularly if that's what I'm after. So I'd look at some of the very, very light frames that are out there. But then you've got to consider your weight too, right? It's one thing getting a really high-end race bike. When you say high-end cross bike, it's all about weight mainly, not so much about speed. It really depends. But I'd say top-end bikes, go for the main brands, go for the major brands. Don't go out of the ordinary. You get bespoke bikes that profess to have this and that and the other. It's not really the case. It's something I could talk about in the future, about full monocoque frames. And there's some bikes coming on the market now that are full monocoque frames, meaning that none of the parts of the bikes were glued together. And you'll see some of these high-end bikes, this is where the price points are going.
What are your thoughts on the stiffness of frames for a heavier rider? For example, someone who's 85 to 95 kilograms. This person is in that category and would happily buy a heavier frame versus a lighter frame if he knew that the frame was sort of stiffer and stronger.
It's a good question, because bicycles are generally, high-end carbon bicycles are generally, you'll see when you buy a high-end bike, there's a kind of a weight limit on the top end. And there's very good reason for that. Carbon is incredibly stiff, but there's a limit at which the designers thin out those walls to give you a vastly different ride if you were X weight over another weight. You might be surprised to know that carbon bikes are, just in terms of a gentle weight on top of them. I don't know if any of you remember the Dogma 65.1s or the 60.5s when they came out in the 2000s. Nobody knew what that number was. That number is the amount of tonnage that can be applied to the frame before it breaks. Now you say 65 tons, you must be joking. But you've got to understand that's a gentle weight over the whole frame. It's no pointed weight, but that is the structural strength at which that frame at that time was able to handle. Now if you take a pothole plus speed plus weight plus inertia, you're starting to add some big numbers up, and you start entering into some scary figures. So being a bike manufacturer, you have to always produce a bike that is robust enough not for the family to take out any legal action on them. So you can be rest assured that most bicycles today, doesn't matter really how expensive and thin and light they are, there's always going to be a certain rule within the manufacturing community of what is safe and what is not safe. And they don't put prototype on them for a very good reason, because they've tested them to a certain point. It's just the technology that's got behind them has got to a point where they can compress the carbon enough that they can produce a bike of, the likes of 500 grams, which is incredible. Again, I say that doesn't mean that the bike is robust enough. It just means that structurally it can still handle a certain amount of weight. You should ask the question more about what is my seat post, the weight at the seat post point and the down tube, the seat tube, and how that can handle an impact, and whether you get any cracking around that area. That's something that needs to be investigated a bit more when we come to the thin and light frames for heavier riders.
So there were a couple of questions about time frames and look frames, and if they are really a cut above the rest.
I can understand why that question's asked, because right from the early days, and I can't remember whether it was time or look, but the audience will know, there was the weave pattern style weaving of the bike. It was like making a sock, and they used a wax insert, and that wax insert was then melted out so they could produce the most incredible undercuts in their frames, which made them very different, and they could develop different styles of structural strength in frames that other frames didn't have with the traditional mold system and the bladder. That said, there's a huge evolution across the brands where there's a lot of technology and know-how that's kind of brought the level closer. Whereas back then, there were some wild ideas, from hand winding carbon thread, 3K carbon thread around the head tube joints and so on and so forth, and that made the bike stronger in those areas. Argon, BMC, very experimental company. Stork was another one who invented the way of removing gases from the matrix, which made the walls collapse and get them thinner, and that was back in the 2000s. Whether time or look, I've still got that advantage over the other bikes. I'm not aware of that. I know that either one have played around with adding things like Kevlar and color type carbons into their seat tubes, for example. Personally, I don't see the point of that, because once the carbon breaks and you fall off, it's broken. You can't save it. But I can understand them experimenting with impact issues. So from that point of view, they've been always very, very advanced. But whether they're a better bike or not is another subject.
How strong are carbon forks? I was thinking about doing an electric conversion, and one option was for the front wheel to be converted.
I would say if you were asking me this and it was a metal forks, aluminium forks, I'd say, try. But with carbon, they're specifically designed for specific purposes. If you, as the owner of that frame, if you have taken no part in the design and understand the parameters around the failure point of those forks, I can say to you quite clearly, you shouldn't mess with carbon forks. For example, you wouldn't understand where the intrinsic strength lies in the fork. So if you drill the hole to make a mount point, what are you compromising? There's this myth about carbon, it's a dark art material and so forth. The issue about carbon is that it's built to its optimum for its purpose. So if you don't understand what the purpose was of those forks and what their parameters were, then I wouldn't mess with them.
So Rob, how did you get into Carobn Repair?
You mean this is about me? You want to know about me? Some of you may know I am an industrial designer by profession. So I got my degree in the early 90s and specialized in polymers, not so much composites, but polymers. And back then carbon wasn't even a thing. So that wasn't something I looked into. But many, many years later, it was a side hobby. I thought I'd get myself a broken bike and build it and see what it took to make a carbon repair. And through trial and error, from hurting myself on wheels and things, realized the limitation of the material, but more importantly, how that material really works when you repair something. So I learned the hard way. And it just grew from there. I think I was on a ride once and somebody pulled up next to me and said to me, wow, that's a really cool bike, because I had everything carbon on that bike and just about 90% of the bike was completely repaired. It was a trial bike. And he said, when I told him I'd repaired this bike, that's when it started. Bicycle shops started contacting me. Can you help me? This bike broken, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't know what to charge. So it kind of really went from there. And it just, I've been totally amazed, really. It's to even turn out to be a business, but it's a very successful business, and more importantly, it's really nice not to waste and throw these bikes away. I think we're on over 15,000 bikes that we've done since we started, and I think somebody did some calculation the other day and said we could get to the bottom of the Mariana Trough and up the Burj Khalifa twice just if we put bikes on top of each other. That's how much we've saved in saving bicycles from being scrapped. So it's a worthwhile business. I'm really glad to be involved in it, and all power to Repair.
Is there a point in which the lightness of a frame impacts its safety?
I've said this before, and it's a really boring answer, but carbon is an evolution. It's always evolving. I can promise you that bikes that were made 3 years ago are made slightly differently now. So what was 700 grams 3 years ago, 700 grams now, I'm pretty sure is a safer bike. And if it's not, that brand won't last long. The first most important thing for any brand is their name, surviving a very, very robust and competitive industry. If you're going to produce a bike that's pushing the limits of weight, then you're going to have to do your homework. And that's why I keep saying the safest light bike that you can buy is one from a major brand, because they would have no doubt done their homework. That's not to say that the bike is more robust than another. It just means it's more fit for purpose. And if you were to ask me why you would, or I was to ask you why would you buy a light bike, it certainly wouldn't be for time trialing, and it wouldn't be for going down hills. It would be for climbing, purely. So out of the three things that a bicycle does, which is ride on the uphill, flats and downhills, the light bike only really functions for one particular part of those three elements. In racing, the competition is based on the climbing. And if you can win in the climbing, that's where you can get the biggest differential between the two. So it's become a thing that weight is such a big issue for carbon bikes. And we all want a light bike because we think that a light carbon bicycle is the best thing to have. But I challenge you, riding a light 700 gram frame into a headwind, you might feel it slightly differently. And that's why you find mountain bikes don't have a weight, there's not a big weight thing, or time trial bikes in particular. If you picked a time trial bike up today, you'd be quite surprised how weighty the bike is. It's very, very important to understand that the robustness of a bike for weight, which is the original question, is the safety comes first, and then experimentation comes to that. So it's fit for purpose. Don't clamp that bike on its top tube. Don't do anything without being very, very careful with that bike. But as you ride it, that bike should be perfect.
If you damage a carbon bike beyond repair, what is best to do with it? I've got a frame that's written off at home, but I refuse to take it to the dump because surely there's someone who will recycle it for me.
No, is the answer. You won't be able to recycle it. Nobody can recycle carbon in that way. They can turn it into fodder for gardens, but there's not much nutrition in it. It's a real issue. Once it's formed into a material with epoxy, which is a thermoset, which means that the chemical process has then converted itself into this material that doesn't degrade. It does degrade if you put it in the sun, but it's not something that Earth can use. The other part of that is you say written off. I'm not sure what you mean. Maybe it is generally written off like this bike here. If you look at this bike, it just looks like a standard XR4 Bianchi or Terre. Very nice looking bike. This one was written off. This one came to us in a bin bag, right? And it was snapped across here, completely wrecked. And we did it for a YouTuber, and he hasn't come back to collect it. But we use this bike to share with our customers who are concerned about what is written off and what's not written off. Now, of course, there's an economic reason for, maybe the bike's not worth repairing because it costs money to do. But there's no such thing as writing carbon off. There's certain parts of the bike that we won't fix because we can't test those things to destruction. But if on a bike like this, which is broken there, and somewhere else, I can't remember, there's enough portions on this bike for the bike to fail slowly for it not to cause any problems. But it won't because it's back to where it was.
I've been riding 2 fake Chinese Pinarellos for 10 years. Fairly fine with them. I would like to buy a new bicycle. With these market prices, why should I think of spending 5 times more on a name brand bicycle? Should I buy Chinese again? I don't race.
Why not? Why not? I mean, if you asked me this question back then when you bought those bikes 10 years ago, I'd say you got lucky. Now, the standardized carbon frames from China, as I've said a few times, is a lot better. So you're not taking the risk. And yes, if you don't race and you're not a weekend warrior with badges all over you, fine. Why not? I don't see the point. I don't see the value in driving a Formula One car down to the local store. You don't need that. You just want to ride, you enjoy riding. You can ride an alloy bike. It doesn't matter. So yeah, I would go with that.
A big thank you to Rob from Carobn Bike Repair for answering all your questions and giving us his time. You can watch this video next, which goes into detail about carbon fiber and specific features on carbon fiber frames. Lots of good info in that one. So hopefully I will see you there.